about those requirements, the picture is different in the EU and the UK. Do you think that the frameworks across Europe are going far enough to tackle the issue so far?
I don't think they are, to be honest. I think the UK could go further in terms of its legal framework for sure. They don't have a due diligence legislation. They don't have any specific legislation on forced labour, for example, in the UK. In the EU, I think we should have stuck with the legislation that was agreed at the end of last year by the decision makers. But, obviously for political reasons, that legislation has been reopened, which, as a side note, I think also, makes the EU look weaker globally because so many jurisdictions were looking to the EU to be a leader in that
set the
space.
Standards, yeah.
Exactly.
This is Shine On Policycast, SolarPower Europe's podcast dedicated to EU policy about solar, with updates in 20 minutes or less. So welcome to this edition of Policycast, and this week we're joined by Rachel Owens, who is CEO over at the Solar Stewardship Initiative. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much.
And it's great that you're joining us today to talk about the work of the Solar Stewardship Initiative. And it's been growing the last few years, but maybe you can just tell listeners who maybe don't know so much about it what your work is and what the organisation does.
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me. So the Solar Stewardship Initiative is a global multi-stakeholder assurance scheme. And that basically means that we both set the standard for the solar sector or the solar PV sector, but we also do third-party certification. And this all originated from some of the reports that came out in around 2020, 2021, looking at the issues of kind of human rights, labour rights issues, and particularly forced labour in the solar supply chain, as well as other sectors. And really SolarPower Europe, SolarPower UK came together, and the industry came together and said, what can we do about this? And realized that they needed to create a kind of an organization which could really set that high standard, but also ensure that it was enforced through their third-party certification.
And can you tell me a little bit more? What is a third-party certification? Why is that so important?
Yeah, I think it's super important. So it's a bit like, if you're buying from a manufacturer site, so you want to buy your modules from a site probably based in China, do you want to ensure that, that the company is just providing you with that reassurance? Or do you want a third party to be going into that site, talking to the workers, looking at the conditions, the health and safety, looking at the kind of environmental considerations that they're taking, and that's what the third party does. It's basically globally recognized assessment bodies that we have approved and we have trained. They go through exams, for example, and they're the ones that go onto the site level and really check the environmental, social and governance standard, as well as whether the products are traceable back to mines.
Okay, so it's it's really an independent assessment, independent audit, whatever, on the performance of these sites. And it's, you mentioned that, SolarPower Europe and Solar Energy UK were involved in the launch of the SSI a few years ago. And it's, it's really important, also for me working in the sector, to see that the sector cares about this issue and is working to improve the quality of our supply chains. But there's also a place for law in this, right? Command from law is what's going to drive change in many ways. So how does the SSI fit into that? Because the EU has supply chain sustainability laws in different places at the minute. The UK also has its own endeavours. Where does the SSI fit in?
Yeah, it's a great question. So from my perspective, the SSI is very much complementary to legislation. Legislation, as you said, is that really key driver. And we see that legislation has a really important role in the solar sector to drive change and ensure we have high environmental, social and governance standards, as well as ensuring that products are traceable, and really tackling this very serious issue of forced labour, which we see in the sector. So key piece of legislation for the kind of sector to be aware of is the EU forced labour regulation, which should be coming in around end of 2027. So what the SSI is doing is really helping, particularly the solar PV sector, really get ready for that legislation, which is effectively an import legislation. So, looking at what kind of documentation, what kind of proof those companies will need to be able to import their products into the EU. And that will obviously impact multiple sectors, but particularly, obviously we're here to talk about the solar sector. There's also other pieces of legislation like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is a bit of a mouthful. And that is really about ensuring that companies are conducting due diligence all along their supply chains to check for risks and to mitigate those risks. There's some political changes happening on that legislation at the moment, and that's in discussion. But my key message is that legislation should be strong, but the solar sector will need to effectively be doing that due diligence along its supply chains. So yeah, the SSI is really a tool to support the sector, to ensure that it's kind of compliant with that upcoming legislation. We've done some benchmarking, and really, the SSI is like tick, tick, tick against all this legislation.
Great. So really something to support the industry in meeting its legal requirements. And about those requirements, the picture is different in the EU and the UK. Do you think that the frameworks across Europe are going far enough to tackle the issue so far?
I don't think they are, to be honest. I think the UK could go further in terms of its legal framework for sure. They don't have a due diligence legislation. They don't have any specific legislation on forced labour, for example, in the UK. In the EU, I think we should have stuck with the legislation that was agreed at the end of last year by the decision makers. But, obviously for political reasons, that legislation has been reopened, which, as a side note, I think also, makes the EU look weaker globally, because so many jurisdictions were looking to the EU to be a leader in that
set the
space.
Standards, yeah.
Exactly. But, I think if we get to the end of this year and the CSDDD and CSRD, so that's the kind of reporting framework, is still in place, then I think that is that's a good first step. But yeah, ultimately, from my perspective, particularly coming from a human rights background and coming from like the NGO sector, it's really important that we have that due diligence all along supply chain, because we know that, for example, in the solar sector, much of the risk is really in the upstream part of the supply chain. So if you just stop at tier one, then you're not actually tackling the issues.
And then maybe onto a different type of governance, because we talked about how the SSI is a tool to kind of support the implementation of this law. It was launched by industry a few years ago. It's in a different place now, maybe. But how do you counter challenges that, the SSI is industry marking its own homework?
Yeah, and I think that is, something that, we still hear. I understand in some ways that that perspective from the beginning, because it was industry kind of saying, look, this is a huge issue. How do we grapple with it? Although, of course, there was like real engagement from civil society from the beginning. But, the initial framework and governance was led by industry. Whereas now from May, we have what we call multi-stakeholder governance, which really means it's a bit of a kind of, acronym or terminology, but effectively it means that within our board, so our kind of final decision-making body of the initiative, you have equal representation between industry and non-industry. So the industry side, you have buyers, investors, and manufacturers represented, and on the non-industry side, we have civil society, human rights experts, both kind of climate groups and human rights groups, and then we also have international financial institutions, and that's kind of there to kind of really represent that non-industry stakeholder part, and that is represented throughout our governance as the initiative. So both that in terms of the governance, but also the third-party certification that we already discussed. That's not, sometimes at the moment or before the SSI existed, what buyers would have to rely on is self-declaration, whereas actually now what we're seeing is that, as I mentioned, these are internationally recognized assessment bodies which are going in and doing that third-party audit, an independent audit, and that's, I think those two levels of both governance and certification should hopefully give people reassurance into the robustness of the scheme.
And then just to clarify, in the non-industry board members, they're observers or? No,
they're full board members, full voting rights, just the same as industry.
Okay. And that's, I think, quite advanced for this type of scheme, right? I mean, the SSI is trying to push the boat out here with real representation from civil society. And that's quite a milestone. But then thinking about other milestones, we recently celebrated the SSI's third birthday, right? Yes. So 3 years really as a organization. What were the milestones that we've achieved in that time? Because it's really flown by, I think.
Yeah, it has. I mean, I've only been in the initiative since April, so definitely credits due to all of the staff and the team that worked on the initiative before I joined. And I do think it's important to kind of take a step back and say, look, even compared to other initiatives in other sectors, the SSI really has moved quite fast and has really tried to set that standard as high as possible. Obviously there's much more we could do in terms of engagement with affected communities, with civil society, broader stakeholders. But, I think that, there has been a lot of progress made. And I think it's linked to the fact that everyone knows that how important solar is going to become for the green transition. And so we want to ensure those high standards are in place as that transition rolls out. But looking to the future, even for the rest of this year and then for next year, so really we're rolling out our traceability standard, which, as I mentioned, is about going from modules to mines, and really looking at that upstream part of the supply chain, ensuring that we've got, a good visibility and can really check that the ESG risks are being mitigated throughout the supply chain. So those assessments are going to be starting in November. That's really exciting and really important milestone. So looking for potentially some of the first certifications, depending on obviously the assessments, in quarter kind of 2 next year. So, and I think those two we've already got 12 sites certified against our ESG standard, and now looking to have more sites certified against the traceability standard. Other key milestones are we're launching our buyer's guide in December at the Sustainable Solar Europe event on 3rd of December. And that's going to be a really important tool for our buyer members to really look at their procurement, their responsible sourcing, and ensure that they're tackling these issues. Some other important kind of parts and kind of milestones are really looking at kind of building the SSI's presence in the upstream part of the supply chain. As I mentioned, that's where we see some of the risks. So looking at growing our membership, growing our certification, and already we're on the cusp of reaching 100 gigawatts of certified ESG capacity, which is really exciting.
Yeah, that's really impressive. Congratulations. And maybe then just on targets. So the SSI setting some targets for capacity that you want to be certified, or other kind of milestones that we're looking forward to.
Definitely. So we've just agreed in our in the last couple of months to have targets for our manufacturing members. And what that really means is when a manufacturing member joins the SSI, they have to put forward 2 sites for certification within the first year. And that's been a really important first step. But now what we've agreed at the board level, and obviously that's the multi-stakeholder board, that certain targets will have to be, in terms of the number of sites, certified over the coming years. So by the end of 2027, it will be 80% of the module sites certified, which will be shipped to Europe and the UK. And by the end of 2028, it will be 100% of those modules shipped to Europe and the UK. So really important in terms of that critical mass of certification, so that the buyer members of the SSI and broader in the market will feel comfortable that there's enough of that critical mass to be buying from in terms of certified sites.
But that's such a, I've said the word milestone a few times, but I mean, what a kind of record to aim for, to this 100%, of our membership, which represents, or SSI's membership, it represents how much of the solar sector is?
So in terms of manufacturing members, it's 70% of the global manufacturing supply chain.
Right. So, and then by 2027, you say, 2028, that 100% of their imports to Europe, which is EU, UK, other part, EA perhaps?
Yes, exactly.
Will be certified, though independently audited and certified, which is it's quite impressive. So congratulations. And I think it's something that we'll talk about more in the next weeks, and certainly at the Sustainable Solar Europe event in December, on the 3rd of December, and then maybe we can catch up after that and hear a bit more about the SSI's very quick progress, it seems. But thanks so much for sharing your insights today, Rachel, and we'll keep in touch.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Shine On Policycast. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to get updates about new episodes. Shine on.